Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this Innovation Forum webinar. We'll be discussing human rights risks in critical mineral supply chains. I'm Ian Welsh, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. There's no doubt that a wide variety of companies have serious risk exposure on social-related issues in sourcing the minerals needed for the energy transition. From mining operations to the production of consumer electronics, electric vehicles and renewable energy, sourcing risks can be minimised. And that's what we'll be talking about today. To help frame our discussion, we have an expert panel. We have Haj from the International Council on Mining and Metals, with Shahila from Anglo American, James from Trafigura, and Angela from Fairphone. Welcome to you all. Now, I'll turn to our panelists very shortly, but we do want to hear from you. Please be thinking about points and questions that you'd like for me to put to our panel and write them into the Q&A box on your Zoom window. Please note your name and organisation when putting your question. You can, of course, like others' questions by clicking the thumbs up, and the more likes, the greater chances that I will put that question to the panel. Okay, let's get cracking. Welcome to the webinar. Perhaps you can set the scene around the human rights risks emerging in the sector and the role of industry bodies to advance performance. Haj.
Hi, Ian. Thanks for the introduction. It's really great to be here to discuss what is certainly a really big challenge for the industry at the moment in relation to the energy transition. So it's good to have spaces like this for dialogue and collaboration. So just in terms of setting that scene for us about the human rights risks that are emerging in the sector in relation to the energy transition, it's really important for organizations like ICMM to play a role in promoting respect for human rights. And before I get into perhaps some of these risks, for those of you who may not be familiar with ICMM, we are an industry leadership organization focused on responsible mining and sustainable development. We have our own voluntary standard called the Mining Principles, which define good practice ESG performance expectations for the industry. So when it comes to the energy transition, again, mining is going to be at the center of this transition. And if we are going to meet the estimated supply needs for this transition, we know that there's going to be more potential impacts, not only on the environment, but on communities, on people. And a really big challenge for the industry is around how we're going to meet our supply needs while ensuring that there is strong respect for human rights and that this is done in a just and rights-respecting manner. So really taking effective measures to address these growing risks to human rights is essential and even more so important when we consider more vulnerable populations, especially, what comes to mind are the impacts on Indigenous people's rights, human rights defenders, women and girls, workers, and many more. So this is really where international instruments like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are so important and have continued to play a really strong role in informing how companies can undertake robust human rights due diligence and meet their corporate responsibility to respect human rights. We're also dealing with a context where companies are increasingly being legally required to integrate consideration for human rights risks and issues across their businesses, and to be able to publicly report on this. So the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive really comes to the forefront of my mind and has a particular emphasis on due diligence across parts of the value chain. So acknowledging all of these considerations, at ICMM over the last 3 years, we've had an increasing focus on these issues and recognized that a lot of work has been done over the last 10 years since the UNGPs came into play, but that companies do remain at different stages of integrating the UNGPs across their businesses. And so this is why over the last 3 years, we've had a dedicated human rights and Indigenous peoples project to build on our longstanding commitments to ensure the respect for and enhancement of human rights, with a special focus on the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples. So we've, through this project, achieved a lot, and that's included updating our mining principles to strengthen respect for the rights of human rights defenders and Indigenous peoples. We've done a lot to update and review our commitments around Indigenous people specifically. And in August of last year, we updated and revised our Indigenous peoples and mining position statement, which has now got 9 new commitments for our members to respect Indigenous peoples' rights. So while strengthening commitments is crucial, we also understand that there is an implementation gap. And so that's why in 2023, ICMM updated our human rights due diligence guidance to help mining companies better navigate the human rights landscape and to better integrate the existing risks into their risk management approaches. We've also recently launched 3 new additional tools to our human rights due diligence guidance to support companies in respecting human rights defenders, integrating human rights across their businesses, and to build awareness of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And beyond this, we're increasingly focused on working with our membership to develop and run tailored human rights training workshops, which build off of our human rights due diligence guidance and aim to support our membership in implementing due diligence processes. And maybe really quickly before I wrap up, I also wanted to briefly mention that there is currently an initiative underway to simplify the current mining standards landscape, and that's through the Consolidated Mining Standard Initiative. So this is an initiative to consolidate the standards from ICMM, the Copper Mark, the Mining Association of Canada, and the World Gold Council into one global standard and multi-stakeholder oversight system. The initiative is aiming to expand responsible mining practices to thousands of companies worldwide, irrespective of size, commodity, or geography. And the final standard will integrate and build upon the robust human rights related commitments of the 4 partner organizations that I mentioned, and will cover several areas of requirements relating to human rights, Indigenous peoples, responsible supply chains, child labor, modern slavery, just to name a few. So I'd really recommend that those on the webinar today stay tuned in to this process and initiative and just kind of keep watching where it goes in the next few months. Back to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Haj. I'm really interested to hear what you said about Indigenous people's rights. It strikes me that there are often different cultural norms in terms of things like land tenure, which are really, really important when you're working out and ensuring that rights are respected. How does your guidance deal with those issues around culturally specific land tenure procedures?
So really it's built off of ensuring that companies are undertaking robust human rights due diligence and to ensure that they are assessing and understanding the impacts and rights to all affected Indigenous peoples in relation to any operations or activities. What we've really focused in on with this updated position statement is that companies should be obtaining agreement with those who are affected by any sort of project. And so that would include consideration around land tenure. Obviously, if land is owned by Indigenous peoples, companies need to be ensuring that they have the authority and agreements in place to be able to undertake any sort of activities in partnership with Indigenous peoples.
Thank you very much. Well, lots to come back on, and thanks so much indeed, Haj. We'll be back to you a little bit later on. Thank you. So, Shahila, let me turn to you. From an extractive business's perspective at Anglo American then, how are the risks evolving, particularly for the minerals that are critical for the energy transition? Shahila.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And just to also say thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation. I think having a sort of value chain discussion is incredibly useful. So thank you for that opportunity. I think from a perspective of the extractive side, really the critical minerals conversation doesn't necessarily change the nature of the risks that mining brings. So it's not that the criticality or the transition necessarily moves the risks into a different space. So, our core risks are around health and safety of our workforce, around the impacts on people from environmental impacts, looking at community-related impacts. You've just discussed a few of them in terms of changes in land use or the interactions between workforce and community, and looking at labour rights and including, that broader set of rights into supply chains. And that landscape doesn't necessarily change because of the critical minerals. Of course, depending on what the minerals are and where they are, the specifics of what those risks are and the specifics of those impacts will vary. But I think, one of the key things, though, is the climate the changes in the climate itself are potentially exacerbating some of those risks. So I think there's one point here, which is that need for transition is something that's recognized more widely. So this, what we're talking about in this human rights risk management is not to be a barrier to critical minerals or to transition. There's certainly a recognition that climate change itself has the potential to be increasing the vulnerability and increasing human rights risks. But what is key is to recognize that how extraction has taken place historically isn't going to be the...
Oh, Shahila, we lost you. Let's give Shahila a little bit of time to come back. You're back. You're back.
I'm here. Okay, sorry.
Great. You're coming to a really, really important point as well.
I'm sure it was a very important point. I think where I stopped was use the same models of the past. So the people who have historically been excluded from decision making in mining, they can't be excluded. So I think the point of this is that the people who are impacted directly by this extractive activity need to be included in how we move forward and how we develop mining opportunities now and for the future. And for our own sustainability, as a mining sector, as a company, it's sort of recognizing, for want of a better term, what we've called for a while now, this social license to operate. But one of the things that I think I can speak to evolving is that there's an increasing alignment between that social license to operate and literal license to operate. So I'd say when I started in this 20 years ago, what you needed to do to get a permit or the support for a permit might be quite different to human rights due diligence. But now there is an increasing convergence between actually getting access to permits, maintaining access to permits, and meeting stakeholder and rights holder expectations in that regard. But one of the key things is really recognizing that those local stakeholders in those areas that are impacted by mining, they're not a homogenous group. So there is also a range of perspectives that we also need to understand, and a range of outcomes that we need to work towards for different stakeholders from what we're delivering in the mining sector. I think one of the key things, though, that we are seeing in this critical mineral space is it's a conversation that is now of interest to a much wider group of stakeholders. And so there's a wider audience who is asking the questions around human rights due diligence and what does that look like. But I suppose there are some questions here because, again, you've got that wider group of stakeholders. Do they all interpret that information in the same way? Do we all agree on what success and due diligence looks like? And so I think that's one of the evolving pieces right now, and why I appreciate these conversations with a wider group of people is to understand what is this range of expectations? How do we look at what success looks like? We're certainly very focused on understanding that with our local stakeholders, but critical minerals brings in this wider audience. So how do we think about that with that greater scrutiny and attention?
Great, thank you very much indeed. I wonder how the internal conversations have evolved. You mentioned that there's been a move from perhaps a more voluntary approach on due diligence around for human rights issues to a more regulated approach. How's that caused the internal conversations to develop? Because inevitably, once you have a regulation to meet, the whole conversation internally is going to change a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is actually some of what we're working with is how do we bring this into something much more integrated and streamlined so that we do these things once. I think how social performance, for example, has evolved in the mining sector over the last 20, 30 years has not always been directly linked into something like the permitting activity. But now actually we're seeing the benefits of bringing this thinking and these thought processes together much, much more closely, because they are informing each other. And I think if you were to look 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. So internally, as you pointed out, Ian, you know, there is this need for us to bring some of these conversations together and improve how we're sharing that information internally and how we act on that.
Thanks very much indeed. Again, lots to come back on. Audience, I can guarantee you, if you put a question in right now, you'll get it answered, because we have none. So please, we have our first question has arrived just as I said that. So please do be thinking of your questions, and we'll come to them a little bit later on. Okay, James, welcome. Perhaps you can highlight the role of a commodity trader in developing the due diligence best practices, given the positioning of where Trafigura are within value chains. James.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ian, and many thanks to the Innovation Forum for offering me the opportunity to speak now. It's fantastic to connect with so many people and to be on an amazing panel. A tough act to follow, so thank you for those who've gone before. Yeah, I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity to explain what it is that commodity traders do, and Trafigura in particular, because it's a conversation that that hasn't often been had in the past. So forgive me, but I'm going to start from quite the sort of basic level, which is simply to say that our role is connecting vital resources. So we purchase an array of commodities, often from remote locations, and we bring them to international markets. Our mission, my mission particularly, is to ensure that we do that in a safe, efficient, and responsible manner. To put it all into context, we operate at scale. So last year we handled over 450 million tons of oil, refined products and gas, and metals and minerals. So to put that into greater context, that equates to around 15 million lorry loads of stuff, if you could get them into lorry loads. So to operate responsibly, we deploy infrastructure, logistics, and financing. We have a relatively small asset base, so we own some mines, for example, worldwide, but far more is done on a contractual basis. So, for example, we have over 350 shipping vessels on charter at any one time, and so bringing transparency and trust to these really complex supply chains is super important, particularly given the current context, and as Shahila outlined in the, for example, regulatory space. We see a huge variance in risk tolerance, for example, between buyers, not to mention that, you know, multiplicity of regulatory and voluntary standards. So it's all getting quite confusing. We as traders have a fantastic opportunity to drive positive change. That could be by conducting detailed diligence on counterparts, and really where I get excited is sort of identifying opportunities where you can mitigate potential risks. But here's the thing: the way in which we do that as commodity traders has not, if you like, been codified beyond looking at the guidance as already referenced, UNGPs or OECD guidelines. So, you know, there is no commodity trading book on how this should be done, where, you know, in comparison to the mining space, I would look to the ICMM for standards, or Anglo American, for example, with their social way. So there's real scope for companies like Trafigura to really step up and develop standards that are of greater utility to the trading sector as a whole. And we've done that at Trafigura, for example, in adapting the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative standard for trading purposes. So you can now download a guide to commodity trading transparency that Trafigura played a big part in developing. But really important, I guess, for this conversation is to consider our dual role as a buyer of commodities and also financier, because that really amplifies our sort of potential for good. So as a buyer, we can leverage our purchasing power, basically to incentivize suppliers and producers to adopt more sustainable practices. We can prioritize suppliers that meet high standards of due diligence. And as a result, we can create a ripple effect, if you like, in the industry, encouraging positive change. And we've got some really good examples of where we're buying from smaller sized mid-scale operations, for example, in Latin America, and incentivizing, offering carrots, if you like, to improve. And that sort of improvement really will be from the ground up. So integrating that sort of robust diligence criteria into financing decisions is critical in sort of promoting good practice and contributing to the overall sort of well-being, if you like, of local communities and the environment. So it obviously conducting detailed diligence obviously helps Trafigura mitigate reputational risks and maintain its credibility as a responsible player in the commodities market. But let's be absolutely clear, we as Trafigura, we as commodity traders have to work incredibly hard to build or even rebuild trust. The stakeholders and rights holders that we interact with on a day-to-day basis are really diverse. A really important stakeholder for us is the financial community. So quite simply, our business does not function without access to over $70 billion worth of finance a year. We're privately held. We're not listed. And banks, in my experience, I've been with the business since 2010, have been critical to our journey to becoming a more responsible actor. So fundamentally, again, our role is connecting markets, supplying essential energy and raw materials that the world relies on today and increasingly in future, and to do that efficiently, reliably, and responsibly. There's a lot to be done around, as I said, looking at standards, whether it's the ICMM's consolidated mining standard, and ensuring that we take our suppliers on a journey towards meeting that. But equally, many other buyers will have their own preferences, their own preferred standards, and effectively, as a service company, it's our role to meet those needs. Thank you.
Thanks, James. You said that you have to work very hard to build trust. Why do you think that is?
So there's several reasons. I think let me speak for Trafigura specifically. There have been incidents in our past where we have not acted as we should have done. And so I spend a great deal of time answering questions around incidents, for example, in the Ivory Coast going back to 2006, which were really very significant and had a fundamental impact on our business and offered that almost a catalyst for change, really, for our business. And looking at the majority of businesses, they have had that moment, and the key is learning from that and moving on. As I said, the particular demands of our stakeholders in the financing space can be very specific, very testing, and I really enjoy that. I enjoy those conversations because it does make us better. What's perhaps more exciting for me personally as a competitive person, knowing that in making our business better, more responsible, we are making it more attractive to big buyers, and being able to demonstrate in clear and simple terms that we're acting responsibly ultimately helps us build markets. So there's a real competitive angle to this also.
Thank you, James. Thanks very much indeed. Okay, and thank you also for your questions. Keep them coming. We'll be coming to points from the audience very shortly. Angela from Fairphone, let me turn to you. Thank you very much for your patience. I wonder if you could give us some perspective from what is a relatively small brand. How do you navigate through the human rights challenges, particularly, I guess, given that your brand emerged from the conflict minerals debate? Angela.
Sure, thanks, Ian, and thanks also for the invitation. It's great to be on a panel that actually spans the whole supply chain. So yeah, Fairphone is a European consumer electronics brand, and as you say, relatively small in terms of sales numbers. But our products, smartphones and audio, are extremely complex, and therefore our supply chains really span the globe. And now we've heard from the mining level, the trading level, but maybe it's good to understand that there are another 4, 5, 6, or even more layers after the trading and the refining until it comes to a product like a smartphone. And in one smartphone, you have over 60 chemical elements, and they are not in one place. They are actually spread across hundreds of subcomponents, each with their own suppliers and sub-suppliers. On top of that, all these chains actually constantly change because those component manufacturers, they change their business partners because they find better prices, better quality, or there's some sort of supply chain disruption, which I think in the age of tariffs and export bans, we are going to run into more and more. So this change is actually a good thing because it means also the supply chains are relatively resilient. But if this is the reality, then how do we deal with this as a downstream brand? And I think the first step is to actually recognize that very likely some of our chains are really connected to human rights risks, because it's very likely that we source from pretty much everywhere at some point in the life cycle of our products. So at Fairphone, we actually are the first ones to say that there's no such thing as a Fairphone yet. So it's really about getting there, taking the first steps. So how do you address human rights risk if you cannot possibly track every atom of every material in every product across every supply chain? And I think we really have to go to an approach that prioritizes hotspots of salient risks, a bit similar as we are doing with scope 3 emissions. We really look at, okay, where are the hotspots and how do we tackle those, because we cannot address everything everywhere. At Fairphone, we try to do this in a sort of two-pronged approach. One is relatively top-down, and I think James also referred to that. It's really setting expectations for the suppliers, building also on standards and audits to a certain degree, and supporting those suppliers in improving their practices. And I think I can speak a bit more to that later, but I'd like to focus on the second piece of it, which is more bottom up, because we can't just rely on contracts and audits and just push the responsibility upwards to the chain. So the bottom-up approach is really trying to prioritize the hotspots and go to the raw material sources, hotspots directly on the ground, and actually there work in a multi-stakeholder setting or with the affected parties, ensuring a bit this continuous stakeholder engagement and voice, or bringing in this wider audience, as actually Shahila already mentioned. So rather than just expecting and requiring good performance, this also has the goal of sort of proactively helping to improve the situation for people and nature, not just trying to eliminate or avoid the risk, which means you can support so-called laggard producers or suppliers. And from our perspective, this is especially important for the smaller producers, operating often in informal economies, such as artisanal and small-scale miners, or in other sort of commodity chains. We can also think about small-scale farmers. One thing that we should start think about as an industry are small-scale recyclers, because they also produce materials and minerals. And there's a lot of informal recycling going on worldwide. I can give maybe two concrete examples of two different minerals, but Ian, I'll pause because I'm not sure I have enough time. So I'll give it back to you first.
Please do. I was actually going to ask you, do you have examples of specific supply chains you could share with us?
Sure. Maybe I can share about gold and cobalt, because these minerals are really used very differently in our products and therefore have different supply chains. So cobalt is really concentrated. It's a specific case. It's concentrated in one component, the battery, which makes it relatively easy to investigate the chain. So we can go through our battery suppliers, and there we actually know the cobalt is from the DR Congo. And the DR Congo is still, I think, the largest producer of cobalt at the moment. but there is also 7 to 10% of that production coming from artisanal and small-scale mining. And we know that is really a hotspot in terms of human rights and other risks for actually anyone using cobalt. So very early on, we decided we don't just want to spend our resources and efforts in trying to exclude artisanal mining and trying to kind of pull away the supply chain. Even if we tried, we probably couldn't. So we actually want to step in and help improve the situation for those miners, the workers, and their communities. So that's part of the reason why we co-founded the Fair Cobalt Alliance, which is a multi-stakeholder alliance working really on the ground to help improve the situation at the mine site, but also around it, addressing working conditions, incomes, child labor, all the things that you would consider human rights risks. And I'm happy to expand more on that. Maybe to mention gold. This is a completely different beast for us because there's 2 milligrams of gold in one phone, and this is spread across 170 subcomponents. We have 100 gold refiners in our chain, and they change every year. And obviously, it's unclear where they source from, which mines, because that also changes constantly. So it's very clear we will never be able to trace 2 milligrams divided by 170 chains to the source. So our efforts actually need to be at a sector level and looking at where are the hotspots in the gold sector. There we also identified artisanal and small-scale mining as one of those hotspots because we know 20% of gold is coming from approximately artisanal mining linked to fueling conflicts, using mercury, child labor, obviously a lot of issues. And then gold is actually also the second highest CO2 hotspot after aluminium on our material level. So that is more connected then to the large scale extraction. So what we do, we also work on artisanal and small scale mining. We started with actually physically integrating fair trade certified gold into our chains. But this was painstaking because it required physical tracking of gold, all the documentation across the chain. We managed to achieve 9% of our entire gold consumption after 7 years of work. So this is not scalable. Nobody will do this. It's too much effort. So this is where, and maybe we can talk about this a bit later, we are coming in with a more scalable option in terms of what the chain of custody of this material could look like, namely book and claim models. These are used already in other sectors like palm oil and cotton, where you actually account for what you consume with an equal amount of gold that is produced more responsibly. So in our case, we buy fair mined gold credits for our entire gold consumption. This is how we can actually then account for 100% of the consumption and not just 9% as we were able to do before in the fair trade model. I think I'll stop there and hand back to
Thank
Ian.
you. Thanks, Angela. Really interesting. Thank you. James, I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on what you just heard in terms of the challenges in those two supply chains that Angela mentioned, cobalt and gold. And what does Trafigura do to help brands with these challenges?
Thanks, Ian. And just a fascinating sort of insight. Thanks, Angela. So Trafigura is a significant purchaser of cobalt. We have been for some years. For those who are less aware, cobalt is actually considered a waste material. So it is extracted typically alongside copper or nickel. Right now, the price of cobalt is exceptionally low. And as a result, its attractiveness as a source of finance, if you like, for artisanal mining activities has really gone off the boil. So we've seen artisanal miners move to other materials, including focusing on the copper component of extraction or indeed gold to earn a living. This is an incredibly complex environment. The artisanal sector is massively important, however, for the metals and minerals value chain. And that is something that we have sought to communicate actively. In fact, in 2019, I remember our chairman speaking at the London Metals Exchange and quite simply communicating the fact that this is an important part of the metal supply chain. We would rather it wasn't there, but actually industry has to come together to address that. So at the time, we ran a large artisanal mining formalization program around cobalt. We don't run that at this stage. But that was a real learning. And I think Trafigura did play an important part in changing the conversation, which is that rather than denying that artisanal mining is taking place, actually accommodating it potentially into the value chain. So what can companies like Trafigura do? Well, a message that I often try and communicate is around pragmatism. When we conduct our detailed diligence and we identify that there is artisanal mining that may be occurring within a concession that we are buying from, rather than refusing to buy from that concession in future, rejecting that material, actually it's taking a more pragmatic role. So we will not accept artisanal material into our chain. However, we're happy to work with large concession holders to find some form of accommodation. That could be, for example, looking at ways in which they can encourage formalization. So investing in capital equipment to lift those operations out of their very basic form into a semi-mechanized form. There are a range of different mechanisms, if you like, that I spoke at Indaba on just a couple of weeks ago that I think can or must be explored. Because again, if the world is going to purchase, to secure the metals and minerals that are absolutely critical for this transition, we need to accept that the artisanal material is in the chain, that we need to do something about it. And there are ways in which that material can be accommodated responsibly if the right checks, balances, controls, etc. Are put in place.
Thank you, James. Shahila, let me turn to you. Perhaps you can reflect a little bit on what you heard from Angela, but I also wondered if you can respond to a question we've got from our audience around the social license point that you made. And his question is really asking specifically how your board evaluates and measures the strength of social license when they are inevitably several steps removed when they're making that decision. So what's the kind of process internally that judges the strength of that?
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think perhaps just reflecting a little bit on what Angela spoke about, I think what I really appreciated was the thoughtfulness about the systems level impact. So I think having spent that time on doing that tracking, to be able to take a step back and say, is this having the impact that we want? Deciding that actually, is there something that we could do which could have more of a systems level and scalable impact, and changing your approach around that. I really appreciate that sort of as a thought process and as an evaluation, and then changing direction to be very driven by the level of impact that you can have. I think that's sort of a really important sort of behavior for us as we go through this in understanding what effective human rights risk management and impact management looks like. And then in terms of understanding the decision-making process. So really, as any mine evolves, there are stage gates in how the mine is designed, in understanding the potential risks and impacts. And so at every stage gate, there's an expectation of what will be the level of risk assessment or impact assessment, the stakeholder engagement that will have gone through that. And prior to that being sent to any investment committee, that will be reviewed by subject matter experts from different parts of the business to see if it's in line with our own standards, as well as to understand what are the risks that are coming up and what are the impacts that are being flagged by our stakeholders. What is it that we're doing about it? So it's really through these different levels of expertise and then accountability that the decisions get made and the management measures we ensure that the standards and policies are adhered to. So the investment committees will be set up specific to each of the projects that will be being evolved. And those will all sit within, I suppose, the operational, the day-to-day part of the business, laddering up into the executive committee. In terms of board visibility of these things, these will be really around material risks to the business that they will be asking about. We've got a number of ways that human rights issues are raised to the board. There is an annual discussion around human rights to the board as at a broad level, understanding trends, understanding performance against our salient risks, but also there will be through the year specific updates on an issue like resettlement, or an issue like alignment with the social way that James mentioned, which is our social impact management standard that we have at Anglo American. And that goes to the Sustainability Committee, which is a subcommittee of our board, as well as in something like labour rights and modern slavery. We have that opportunity with the modern slavery reporting process to have that discussion around modern slavery issues and labour rights concerns as the board is signing off that report. So there are these different levels of expertise and decision-making committees within the organisation that provide that decision-making, and then that flagging of key risks and oversight, which goes to the board, which is really focused on the key material issues.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Haj, let me turn back to you. Please do reflect a little bit on what Angela discussed. And I also wonder if you could just also address a question we've got from our audience, stating that there's been a bit of pushback from stakeholders on the consolidated standard that you've put forward at ICMM, as you're purely a mining organisation, and asking around cooperation with other bodies, including the Institute for Responsible Mining Assurance. So just perhaps you can reflect on that as well, Haj.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that, Ian. And yeah, I think just reflecting on what Angela was speaking about, I'd be keen to understand a little bit more about maybe some of the questions that are being raised from investors to Fairphone. And we know that we're increasingly seeing customers expecting a lot more from automakers, for example. And so investors are also increasingly expecting automakers to have very clear human rights policies, and even more so policies around Indigenous people's rights, and how those companies are sort of addressing risks to Indigenous peoples. So would be keen to maybe explore that further with Angela. But just to reflect on the question that was asked about the consolidated standard, just a clarity point, the initiative includes 3 other partners along with ICMM. So as I mentioned, it includes the Copper Mark, the World Gold Council, and the Mining Association of Canada, along with ICMM, who are undertaking this process to consolidate the standard. And so while the process is being driven at this phase by those 4 partners, the proposed governance model for this eventual standard is going to provide equal representation to mining industry and stakeholders and rights holders, as well as to mining's value chain and its stakeholders. So the goal is to have a proposed governance model that is designed to embody this multi-stakeholder oversight system, and will also have an independent board that will be led by an independent chair, along with 17 people on the board, with 16 seats divided equally amongst the 4 groups from mining stakeholders, value chain stakeholders, mining companies, and value chain companies. So again, I think the intent of this process is to build a standard that aims to expand responsible mining practices to thousands of companies worldwide, irrespective of their size, commodity, or geography. And so that's really the goal of this initiative.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, let's turn to more of our audience questions. Thank you very much for them. Keep them coming. James, the question directly for you. You mentioned in your remarks earlier, you're talking about offering carrot for progressive improvements. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about what that looks like and how you go about making the decision to make that a carrot award, as it were. James.
Thanks so much, and great question. I think Jonathan, I think it was. the background is quite simply over the last 10 or 11 years that we've been running our due diligence program for metals and minerals purchasing. We've built a pretty good picture as to where the most profound risks to people lie. In the current climate, there are there are buyers out there who will quite happily turn away from a particular supplier that's in their chain, despite having purchased for years and years. That kind of activity doesn't generate positive outcomes. Our goal is to ensure that we're able to keep markets open responsibly. So where we have identified areas for improvement, we have to work hard to keep that buying line open, if you like, to the extent possible, where those activities are clearly where the impacts are negative but not egregious. So yeah, those decisions to offer carrots typically come at a country level. So we find a particular market, and most recently, a good example may be Bolivia, where Trafigura is a significant purchaser of lead and zinc. There are many other purchasers as well, by the way. We purchase that material from other traders and for example, refiners. So they are often multiple steps removed from activities at a mine site level. However, we, through our diligence, have identified certain areas for improvement in that chain at tier 1, but also at tier 7. So having purchased from Bolivia for many years, having been a key member of that particular market, it's in our interest to keep that market open for business. And as such, we have full support of our commercial colleagues in working much more closely with our suppliers to improve practices. As I said in my earlier intervention, often in a particular country, we have little or no footprint whatsoever. So in that case, we're working with a dedicated consultancy to actually improve the situation on the ground. And we're also exploring working with other partners more broadly, including one particular European government, to ensure that we can move a whole sector in the right direction, towards more responsible production. So, to be frank, the idea around carrots is in many ways a defensive mechanism where we identify scope for improvement, but where we're absolutely committed to sticking with it to the extent possible. There will be exit on occasion, but to basically lead to positive outcomes, if you like, on the commercial side and clearly from a social perspective as well.
Thank you, James. Shahila, I've got a question for you from Ellis, pointing out that with the unprecedented demand for such minerals, mining exploration operations are being pushed into more vulnerable spaces and fragile economies and ecologies. So the question is, if that's the case, what specific strategies or experience can mining companies put in place in that context? So how do you approach that?
Yeah, look, it's a great point. I think there is a lot of experience, that from the mining sector that can be brought to bear in any sensitivity of context. There's always a great deal of work that goes into understanding the baseline context, understanding who are the stakeholders that will be impacted, doing that engagement work. And I think all of that experience is really important. Of course, there's also always ways to improve. And as Haj had spoken about before, overall, we're doing a lot of work to understand what is it about those ways of working that need to be adapted, that need to be updated. And I think a key theme that we need to work on to really get the benefits of the experience we have to date is much more on that point of integration. And I think this is where really that human rights lens to these issues becomes really valuable, because how do you bring together an understanding of environmental context with the context on people, with understanding the capacity of institutions and stakeholders, and build that into thinking about what do those agreements need to look like, what do outcomes look like for different stakeholder groups. So yes, I think there's a lot of experience that can be brought into sensitive environments. But I think that there is also this need for mindfulness on how do we keep improving on those approaches. And I think a key part of that is that integration and sharing across disciplines is going to be really key. And the other element is how do we bring in, that different types of knowledge, recognize those different kinds of institutions and different kinds of stakeholder groups that are there, so that there is that inclusion and representation of perspectives built into that understanding, and then built into how projects get developed, what management measures look like, and how success is evaluated.
Thanks very much. Got lots more questions to get through. So panel, please keep your questions short. We'll try to get through as many as we can. I want to ask a quick question to Angela regarding targets on purchasing recycled minerals. I see you're actually typing an answer, but very quickly, do you have targets on recycled minerals?
Yeah, I was actually typing this. Yeah, so we have targets and KPIs on fair mines and recycled materials. Those who want to know more could find our fair materials roadmap, where we describe that in more detail. And then we also report annually actually on how much recycled and from fair mine sources, as we call them, is in each of our products, looking at our 23 focus materials, which are the materials that we have identified have the highest social and environmental risks attached to their chains.
Thank you very much. So information available on your website. James, Trafigura, what's Trafigura's approach to this?
Thank you. So there's no stated target in respect of recycling, but I would just like to highlight this, and it's a fact that's been increasingly sort of shared in recent months, and that is that there is a certain green halo around recycling, that recycling absolutely should be encouraged, but that does not should not ever overcome the fact that detailed diligence on recycling is essential. And I regret to say that in our own diligence activities, that we have identified multiple areas for improvement, because there is, of course, an underbelly to recycling that, as an industry, as those involved in the metals trade, we absolutely have to overcome.
Thanks, James. Haj, I wondered if you would like to comment. What's the ICMM's view on the recycling minerals and using recycled minerals versus mined minerals?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly we recognize the importance of circularity and recycling minerals and metals where possible. Do we necessarily think that it's going to meet the increased supply that's required for the energy transition? It's unlikely, but certainly as a first step, that is an important way for the mining industry to contribute to the energy transition in a potentially quite rights respecting way. And it's something that we're increasingly seeing brought up with conversations with a variety of stakeholders and rights holders. But again, just given the recognition of the huge supply that is required, probably unlikely that we will be able to gain the required demand and supply needs based off of recycling alone. And I did see another question about the CMSI in the Q&A. So just to say that is a question that I probably wouldn't be able to answer, but I'm very happy to put you in touch with someone who can answer that question. It's quite detailed about how the CMSI will be funded, but again, very happy to put you in touch with those who would have the answers to that question. Thanks
very much indeed. James and Angela, another question, really interesting, just moving on from the recycled content point. Is there research and development into human-made alternatives to mined minerals for batteries and other uses? Angela.
So Fairphone isn't doing R&D on battery alternatives, but I do know that there's a lot of research obviously going now into what the batteries of the future will look like. I think this is particularly challenging for the consumer electronics batteries because they're so small and they have to have an incredible density for their size. So this is not easy. I think it will come in the next decades or so. The one thing I'd like to point out is that even if we have alternative materials and we kind of come up with synthesized materials, there will still be input materials that we need for those processes, especially also chemicals and chemical elements, which again will have to be produced somewhere. I don't think we will be able to kind of magically make a battery appear, no matter what materials we use, even if it's also just considering the processing materials that we need in the chemical processes. So those will also again have to be mined or produced in a responsible way, both from a human rights but also environmental and emissions perspective. So I don't think they will be the cure-all. It will be just changing kind of the impacts and issues that we will need to look at when new battery technologies come online.
Thanks very much. Getting close towards an end. James, I just want to come to that point very briefly from you. Just, will Trafigura be trading the batteries of the future that won't be necessarily mineral based?
We would always be looking for that opportunity, I think, probably is the quick way of answering.
Good answer. Thanks so much. Okay, we are coming towards the end. And I'm very keen to hear from our panel just in terms of what it is that they've picked up over the last hour or so from the conversation. It's been really fascinating conversation, some really great questions from the audience. So Angela, let me turn to you first. What have you picked up from the last hour that you think we should all be taking away with us in a few minutes?
Yeah, I think 2 points. One, just to iterate also what James just said, I think it's still important to say disengagement is not necessarily the solution. So if we want things to improve, we do need to engage. We do need to see how can we improve things, even if it's slow, even if it's small steps, and not just say we want to step out of this space. I think I also really liked Shahila's mention of, hey, extraction models will actually change because we will need to include the people that have been excluded so far. And how do we do this in a good way, in a practical way? I think these are things that we need to think of in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. James, briefly, please.
Sure. I think one of the main messages that comes across is on progressive improvement. I think opportunities like these where companies and those in the chain actively engage on difficult, hard to handle issues is surely the way forward. So a big thank you again to the Innovation Forum. We need more of these conversations, and as commodity traders, as Trafigura, we're very keen to be a part of these these chances. Thank you. Thanks,
James. Shahila.
Yeah, maybe a bit of a repeat, but I think to highlight the ongoing specific due diligence, opportunity by opportunity, is key, but also having this emphasis on systems impact. And those just may be things that we have to have work streams that do both to tackle the risks up and down the value chain.
Thank you very much for that. And Haj, final thoughts from you.
Yes, thank you. I think from my perspective, just really recognizing that there are increasingly questions and concerns about human rights risks across the supply chain, and that from a standards organization's perspective, this really speaks to the importance of a strong standards landscape, and that there's this recognition that at present there's not enough in terms of mandatory due diligence, so there is really a strong need for strong standards that can support companies in assessing their human rights risks.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to have to draw the discussions to a close then, as we are running out of time, very close to the top of the hour. Many, many thanks to our panel for their time and insight today. And thank you all for your questions and some really interesting points coming from you. The procurement issues that we've been talking about today will be very much part of the conversations next month at this year's Responsible Sourcing and Ethical Trade Initiative Innovation Forum, in London on the 19th and 20th of March. There are still some tickets available. And if you'd like to join us, look out for more details and an exclusive 2-day pass discount in your inbox when we send you the webinar recordings later on, probably in the next couple of days. And critical mineral sourcing and supplies is an area that we are going to be looking at more Innovation Forum, starting with 2 more webinars in the coming weeks. So do look out for those. You can sign up for those now on the Innovation Forum website. So do look out for those. But for now, I hope you found this webinar useful. I've been Ian Welsh, and thank you very much for your time and for joining us.